Winter arrived quietly that year, not with heavy snow, but with a cold that lingered in the bones. The city dressed itself in Christmas lights, golden, hopeful, almost forgiving. Yet inside James, everything felt tense and unfinished. He had learned to live behind carefully built defenses, silence instead of honesty, distance instead of vulnerability. Life had taught him that strength meant endurance, not surrender, or so he believed. It was on one of those ordinary evenings, when the sky darkened too early and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a street corner, that James found himself standing at Diep's door. He did not know why he had come. Perhaps it was the loneliness that grew louder in December, or perhaps it was the simple truth that no one else ever saw him the way she did. Diep opened the door without surprise, as if she had been waiting all along. Warm light spilled from behind her, carrying the scent of simmering soup and freshly washed rice, the kind of warmth that belonged not to wealth or luxury, but to care. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not heavy, it was familiar. "You look tired," she said softly, the words landing gently, without judgment. James tried to smile, but it faltered. He stepped inside and the door closed behind him, shutting out the cold, the noise, the world that demanded too much. When Diep wrapped her arms around him, it was unplanned, instinctive. Yet in that simple embrace, something inside James cracked. His shoulders loosened, his breath slowed. The defenses he had carried for so long, pride, anger, control, began to fall away one by one. In her embrace, he did not need to explain his failures or justify his pain. He did not need to be strong. He was simply allowed to be human. Outside, Christmas music drifted faintly through the window, a reminder that the season was meant for togetherness. Diep guided him to the small table near the window, where 2 cups of tea steamed quietly. The world beyond the glass continued its restless rush, but inside that room, time softened. As they sat there, James wondered, perhaps for the first time in years, what it would feel like to face Christmas without armor, to wake up without fear, to believe that happiness, however fragile, was still possible. And as Diep smiled at him, gentle and patient, the question lingered in the air like falling snow. Could this be the beginning of a happy first Christmas together, or merely a pause before the next storm? Morning arrived wrapped in pale winter light, the kind that slips quietly through the curtains and wakes the world without asking permission. James had not slept deeply, yet he woke with a strange sense of calm. For once, his mind was not racing ahead to unfinished plans or lingering conflicts. Instead, he listened to the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, to the muted sounds of a city preparing for another December day. Diep moved through the room with gentle purpose, humming a tune James did not recognize. It was not a Christmas carol, just an ordinary melody, but it filled the space with life. She handed him a cup of coffee, still hot, reminding him to drink it before it cooled. Such a small thing, yet it carried an intimacy he had almost forgotten. Someone noticing, someone caring without needing to be asked. Outside, Christmas decorations lined the streets. Shop windows glowed with promise, as if happiness could be bought and wrapped in red paper. James watched people pass by, parents holding children's hands, couples laughing over shared secrets, strangers rushing home with bags of gifts. It all looked so simple from the outside, and yet he knew how many hidden struggles walked beneath those lights, how many smiles covered silent battles. In that way, their story felt painfully familiar, like so many lives lived quietly between hope and fear. Later that afternoon, they stepped into the cold together. The air was sharp, but Diep's scarf brushed against James's arm, grounding him. They walked slowly through the market, past pine branches, dried oranges, and handmade ornaments. Diep stopped to examine each one, her eyes lighting up with a childlike wonder that softened something deep within him. He realized then how long it had been since he allowed himself to notice beauty without suspicion. But the calm did not last. As evening approached, James's phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from his father. Short, precise, heavy with unspoken authority. The past, it seemed, had not agreed to stay behind. James's steps slowed. His jaw tightened. Diep noticed immediately. She did not ask what the message said. Instead, she reached for his hand, squeezing it once, firm, steady. A reminder that he was not alone in this moment, even if the road ahead remained uncertain. As Christmas lights flickered on above them, James felt the familiar pull between who he had been and who he wanted to become. Love had opened his defenses, but it had not erased the world's demands. The question was no longer whether happiness existed, but whether he was brave enough to choose it, knowing how easily it could be taken away. That evening, the city seemed to slow, as if holding its breath. Christmas Eve arrived not with fireworks or celebration, but with hush that settled into corners and hearts alike. In Diep's small living room, a modest Christmas tree stood by the window, decorated with simple lights and a few handmade ornaments. Nothing extravagant, yet it felt real, the way ordinary lives always are. James stared at the tree longer than necessary. Its fragile lights reflected in his eyes, trembling slightly, like his thoughts. The message from his father had not left his mind. Authority had a way of echoing even in silence. Old fears returned, fear of disappointment, fear of disobedience, fear of choosing the wrong future. Love, he realized, did not erase fear, it merely forced one to face it. Diep noticed his distance. She set aside the dishes she had been washing and joined him by the window. "You don't have to tell me," she said gently, her voice steady, "but you don't have to carry it alone either." Her words were simple, yet they struck deeper than any accusation. James finally spoke, not in anger, not in defense, but in exhaustion. He told her about the expectations placed on him since childhood, about decisions made on his behalf, about how love had always felt conditional. As he spoke, his voice wavered. The strongest walls are often built to protect the most fragile truths. Diep listened without interruption. When he finished, she did not offer solutions. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder. That quiet presence, free of judgment, became his refuge. Outside, laughter drifted up from the street below. Somewhere, a family was celebrating. Somewhere else, another was breaking apart. Life, James thought, always moved in contrasts. Later, they sat beneath the tree, wrapping small gifts. Diep tied the ribbons carefully, as if every motion mattered. James struggled at first, clumsy and uncertain, until they laughed together, softly, like children trying not to wake the house. In that laughter, something eased. For a moment, the world's weight lifted. Yet beneath the warmth lingered a question neither dared to ask aloud. What happens after Christmas? Love could shelter them for a night, perhaps for a season, but could it withstand the choices waiting beyond the holiday glow? As the lights dimmed and midnight approached, James realized that happiness was no longer an abstract dream. It sat beside him, breathing quietly, asking not for perfection, but for courage. Christmas morning arrived without ceremony. No bells rang, no choir sang beneath the window. Instead, sunlight slipped gently through the curtains, touching the small room with a pale, honest warmth. It was the kind of morning that felt familiar, like the quiet Sundays of ordinary life, where happiness did not shout, but waited patiently to be noticed. Diep woke first. She moved softly, careful not to disturb James, who slept beside her on the sofa, his face finally free of tension. For the first time in a long while, he looked like someone who'd stopped fighting in his dreams. She watched him for a moment, her heart both full and heavy.
Love, she knew, was never just about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let go. When James woke, the smell of warm coffee filled the room. Diep stood near the stove, humming faintly, her back turned. The sound was ordinary, almost mundane, but it stirred something deep inside him. In all his years of success and struggle, no boardroom, no luxury apartment had ever felt like this. They sat together at the small table, sharing a simple breakfast. Outside, children ran past, laughing, their voices bright and careless. Christmas, James thought, belonged to moments like these, not grand promises, but quiet truths. He looked at Diep and finally asked the question that had lingered all night. "Are you afraid?" Diep met his gaze. "Of course," she said honestly. "I'm afraid every day, but I'm more afraid of living a life where I abandon what matters most." Her answer did not push him. It did not demand anything, and somehow that was what gave it power. James stood and walked toward the window. His phone lay heavy in his pocket, filled with missed calls, unspoken ultimatums, and a future already planned for him by someone else. He knew that choosing Diep meant conflict, disappointment, and pain. But choosing silence meant losing himself, slowly, quietly, forever. He turned back, his decision trembling but real. "I don't know how this will end, but I know who I want to stand beside while finding out." Diep's eyes glistened, though she smiled. They did not embrace immediately. Instead, they stood there, allowing the moment to settle, imperfect, fragile, and deeply human. Outside, church bells finally rang, distant but clear. Christmas had come, not as a promise of a perfect future, but as a reminder. Love does not erase hardship. It simply gives us the courage to face it. And in that small room, with no witnesses but the morning light, their first Christmas became something quietly unforgettable, not because it was happy without doubt, but because it was chosen, with open hearts.
The story of James and Diep offers a lesson that speaks gently but persistently to everyday life, where love is rarely simple and courage often arrives without applause. It reminds us that the most important decisions are not made in moments of triumph, but in quiet spaces where the heart must speak honestly. One of the central lessons of this story is that love is not a battle to be won, but a responsibility to be carried. James learns that strength is not found in building defenses, status, or success, but in the ability to lay them down. In Diep's embrace, he does not become weaker, he becomes more truthful. Many people in daily life hide behind roles, child, parent, provider, leader, until they forget who they are beneath them. The story teaches that love has the rare power to return us to ourselves. Another important lesson is the difference between control and care. Fatherly authority, social expectations, and family pressure are often justified as protection. Yet when protection silences choice, it becomes a form of fear. Diep never demands that James fight his family for her. Instead, she respects the bond between father and son, even when it costs her deeply. Through her restraint, the story shows that true love does not force decisions, it waits for them to be made freely. The story also highlights the quiet courage of letting go. Diep's willingness to step back is not surrender, but wisdom. In life, many believe that holding tighter proves love, yet sometimes love is proven by releasing control and trusting the other person's conscience. This lesson resonates with anyone who has ever loved someone enough to risk losing them. Finally, the story teaches that happiness is not the absence of conflict. James and Diep's first Christmas is not perfect, yet it is honest. It shows that real happiness is built not on certainty, but on shared commitment in uncertainty. Love does not promise an easy future, it promises companionship through difficulty. In the end, the lesson is clear. Love thrives where there is choice, dignity, and courage. When we allow ourselves and others to be free, love becomes not a burden, but a quiet light that guides us home.